Four reserve currencies, 500 years of history. Each one lasted roughly a century, and each one ended the same way. Spanish peso, Dutch guilder, British sterling, US dollar. Four currencies, four separate arcs, one recurring shape in the record. This is not a forecast about any currency. This is a catalogue of what has already happened, drawn from the archive. Before we get to the cases, we need to agree on what a reserve currency actually is, because the phrase is modern, and the older cycles use different language for the same role. Chapter 1. A short primer. A reserve currency is the money the world uses when it does business with itself. Not necessarily the strongest economy's money, the money other central banks and merchants choose to hold, to invoice in, and to settle with. Before 1900, there was no formal reserve currency system, but the role existed anyway, in silver content, in bills of exchange, in gold convertibility. The name changes. The role does not. A reserve currency is born from trust in the issuing state, trust in its military reach, its commercial infrastructure, and its willingness to let the currency circulate freely beyond its borders. And history suggests every reserve currency eventually loses that trust. Not because of a single event, because of a slow pattern that has repeated 4 times in 5 centuries. Chapter 2. Spain. The rise of the Spanish peso, the silver piece of 8, began in the 1540s, with the discovery of silver at Potosi in modern-day Bolivia and at Zacatecas in Mexico. For roughly a century, Spain mined and minted silver on a scale the world had never seen. The peso circulated from the Philippines to Antwerp. Prices across Europe adjusted to Spanish supply. By the 1630s, the peso's reserve role was unmistakable. It was accepted everywhere. It was hoarded by merchants and monarchs. It set the global unit of account. But Spain had financed decades of war with silver that hadn't yet arrived from the Americas. Government debt climbed, inflation accelerated across Europe, the price revolution. Confidence in Spanish solvency began to crack. By 1640, the first arc was closing. Spain had not vanished, but the peso's role as the world's currency had begun passing elsewhere. Chapter 3. The Netherlands. The Dutch guilder's reserve era began with the founding of the Bank of Amsterdam in 1609. For the first time, a bank offered deposit accounts in a stable unit of account, separate from the coinage circulating in the streets. That innovation, central banking before central banking had a name, made Amsterdam the financial hub of Europe for the next century. The Dutch East India Company, founded 7 years earlier, was financed and cleared through this system. Trade finance, bills of exchange, and sovereign lending converged in one city. By the 1680s, the guilder was the reserve asset of Europe. Not by decree, by accumulation, the system that held the most trustworthy accounting became the one the rest of the world used. The arc closed roughly a century after it began. Costly wars with France and Britain, a speculative mania around 1720, and the slow shift of commercial gravity to London. By 1720, the Amsterdam era was fading. Chapter 4. Britain. Sterling's reserve era ran from the early 1800s through 1944. A century and a quarter, the longest completed arc in the archive. The foundation was the gold standard, formally established in Britain in 1821, which anchored sterling to a fixed weight of gold and made it the most predictable currency in the world. The infrastructure was the City of London. By the mid-19th century, a substantial share of world trade was invoiced in sterling, even trade that did not involve British parties at either end. The peak was the late 19th century. Sterling was not just a British currency, it was in practice the grammar of global commerce. The First World War cracked the foundation. Britain suspended gold convertibility in 1914. It reattempted and abandoned it across the next 2 decades. The debts of 2 world wars ended any realistic path back. Sterling's reserve role was formally handed off at Bretton Woods in July 1944. The arc had run its century and a quarter, and it closed. Chapter 5. The United States. The dollar's reserve era formally began at the Bretton Woods Conference in New Hampshire in July 1944. 44 nations agreed to a system anchored on the dollar, which was itself convertible into gold at $35 an ounce. The gold anchor held for 27 years. In August 1971, President Nixon ended dollar-gold convertibility. The system became free-floating. The dollar did not lose its reserve role. It adapted. Petrodollar recycling, deep treasury markets, and the absence of a credible alternative kept the dollar at the center of global settlement. As of the writing of this archive, the dollar has held its reserve position for roughly 80 years. Every prior case in the record lasted between 80 and 130 years. Where the current arc stands in its cycle is not a question this channel answers. That is for time to settle, not for commentary to predict. Chapter 6. What all four share. The structural features are remarkably consistent across the four cases. Trust earned through commercial reach, financial infrastructure, exchanges, banks, bills, that lets the currency clear everywhere. Use beyond the issuer. The currency becomes the one that foreign parties choose for trade between themselves, not just with the issuer. That is the inflection point, and, in every completed case, a slow erosion of the underlying trust. Debts accumulated over long periods, military overextension, the emergence of a credible alternative. Never a single event. Always a pattern. Chapter 7. The sequence of decline. 5 phases appear in each of the 3 completed cases. Commercial peak, financial innovation that strains the monetary system. Accumulating government debt, the rise of a challenger with better infrastructure, and a slow drift in settlement practice. No single phase ends the cycle. The cycle ends when several are in play at once, and the world's merchants, central banks, and monarchs quietly begin using something else. This drift typically takes decades. Sterling's decline was visible by 1914. It formally ended in 1944. 30 years of drift from crack to handoff. Chapter 8. What this tells us. 3 completed arcs. 1 current. 4 entries in a 500-year archive. Rare enough that the full shape only becomes visible with a multi-century lens. What happens next in the current arc is not something this channel predicts. That question will be answered by time, by debts, by innovations, by the slow drift of settlement practice. None of those variables sits inside commentary. This channel's job is to hold up the record. What you do with the record is a question for you and an authorized financial advisor who knows your situation. Next in the archive, the long-term debt cycle, 6 repetitions across 500 years. Same rules, no predictions, only what the record shows.